The old train screeched to a halt, sending a sharp shudder through the empty platform. Elise Moreau stood from her seat, her coat tugged tightly around her, and picked up her small suitcase. Beside her, Amélie clutched an old stuffed rabbit to her chest, her wide brown eyes staring out at the unfamiliar landscape. The town of Saint-Emilion, hidden deep in the rolling hills of Provence, looked exactly as Elise remembered. Yet something about it felt different, as if the years had stripped away its warmth, leaving behind only the brittle shell of memory. They stepped down onto the platform, the cold spring wind snatching at Elise's hair. She knelt and brushed a strand from Amélie's face, offering a brave little smile. "We're here, mon trésor," she whispered. "Everything will be all right." The taxi ride from the station wound through narrow country lanes, past fields of lavender just beginning to bloom. In the distance, the grand silhouette of the Moreau estate rose above the trees, its ancient stones glowing faintly in the twilight. Elise's chest tightened at the sight. So many memories lived within those walls, some sweet, some painful, and all of them heavy. Amélie shifted restlessly beside her. "Will they be nice, maman?" she asked in a small voice. Elise hesitated. She could not lie, but she could not tell the whole truth either. "They are family," she said finally. "And family must always find a way to be kind." But deep down, she was not sure she believed that anymore. The car crunched up the gravel drive, and Elise saw them waiting. Juliette, with her stiff posture and impeccable dress, and Antoine tall and distant, arms folded across his chest. Neither moved to greet them. When the car stopped, Elise stepped out first, her heart pounding. Amélie clambered out after her, the stuffed rabbit still clutched tight. Juliette offered a tight-lipped smile. "You finally made it," she said. Her voice was as brittle as dry leaves. "Yes," Elise replied, forcing calm into her tone. "It has been a long journey." Juliette nodded once, sharp and curt. Antoine remained silent, his gaze cold. No words of welcome. No embrace. Not even a warm glance at Amélie, who tucked herself closer to her mother's side. Inside, the house was almost unrecognizable. Gone were the heavy tapestries and warm wood-paneled walls. In their place were sleek, polished floors, minimalist furniture, and cold, gleaming surfaces. It felt like a hotel rather than a home. Elise's footsteps echoed as they followed Juliette through the grand hall. Family portraits still hung on the walls, but many were missing. Notably the one of Elise's grandparents, who had raised her after her own parents died. "They redecorated after grandpère passed," Antoine said, his voice flat. It was the first thing he had said. Elise swallowed her grief and nodded. At dinner, the table was set for 4. The meal was sparse. A thin soup and hard bread. Conversation was stiff, with Juliette occasionally directing clipped questions at Elise about her life abroad, her work, her reasons for returning now, after all this time. Elise answered as politely as she could, but the undercurrent of suspicion was impossible to ignore. Every question felt like a test, every glance a measurement of her worth. Amélie barely touched her food. No one seemed to notice. After the meal, Juliette led them down a narrow back corridor to a small cluttered room. Dust motes floated in the air, caught in the weak beam of a single lamp. "There's no room upstairs," Juliette said, voice tight. "You can stay here." The word stung more than Elise expected. The room was no better than a storage closet. Broken furniture was stacked against the walls. An old threadbare carpet covered part of the cold stone floor. There was no bed, no cot, not even a proper chair. Amélie looked up at her mother with silent confusion. "This will be fine," Elise said softly, forcing cheer into her voice. "We'll make it our little adventure, all right?" Amélie nodded, ever trusting. That night, Elise fashioned a bed from an old pile of coats and laid Amélie down. The little girl clutched her rabbit close and quickly fell asleep, exhaustion overtaking her. Elise sat beside her for a long time, staring at the cracked ceiling. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling into the night. She had known it would not be easy coming back. But she had not expected it to feel like exile within her own home. As the clock chimed midnight, Elise made herself a promise. No matter how unwelcome they were made to feel, she would not let this place break her again. She would protect Amélie, whatever it took. She just did not know that tomorrow would bring the first of many tests to that vow. Morning broke gray and cold over Saint-Emilion. A thin mist clung to the ground, seeping through the cracks in the old house like a living thing. Elise awoke with a start, momentarily confused by her surroundings. The musty smell of the little storage room filled her nose. Beside her, Amelie was still sleeping, one small hand curled around the ear of her stuffed rabbit. Elise rose quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The house was eerily silent. No footsteps overhead. No clatter of breakfast being prepared. Only the faint creak of wood and the low sighing of the wind. She stepped into the corridor. The walls, once lined with rich wallpaper, were bare and cracked. Shadows pooled in the corners. Somewhere deep in the house, a door creaked open. "Maman." Amelie's sleepy voice called out behind her. "I'm here, Mon Ange," Elise said, hurrying back. "Let's get you dressed. We'll explore a little, shall we?" After washing quickly at the cracked sink in their room, Elise helped Amelie into a warm jumper. They crept through the house together, the boards groaning under their feet. They found the kitchen deserted. No smell of coffee. No fresh bread. On the table, a note was pinned under a chipped mug. "Gone to town. Back late. Help yourself." Juliet's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp and tight as ever. Elise sighed and set about preparing a simple breakfast from what little she could find. Stale bread, a jar of honey, and 2 apples from a dusty basket. Amelie ate quietly, her eyes flickering around the cold kitchen. "Can we go outside after breakfast?" she asked. "Of course," Elise smiled. "We'll see the garden." After they finished eating, they pulled on their coats and stepped into the garden. The air was sharp and damp. The gardens had once been magnificent. Rose beds, winding gravel paths, a little fountain at the center. Now, weeds had choked the flower beds, and the fountain was dry and cracked. Amelie darted ahead, chasing a brave butterfly that flitted through the wild grass. Elise wandered slowly, memories stirring with every step. She paused by the old oak tree at the back of the garden. Carved into the trunk, faint but still visible, were the initials EM and AM, Elise and her childhood friend, Adrian. She traced the letters with a trembling finger, wondering where Adrian was now. They had lost touch after she left for university. A sudden sharp laugh shattered her reverie. Elise turned quickly. In an upstairs window, she glimpsed a shadow, the outline of a woman watching them. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. Uneasy, she called out, "Amelie, stay close to me." The little girl obediently scampered back to her side. Later that afternoon, they explored the ground floor of the house. The drawing room, once full of music and laughter, was dark and dusty. Sheets covered the old furniture like ghosts. In the library, Elise ran her fingers along the spines of the books, many of them untouched for years. A strange draft stirred the pages of an open book left on the central table. She frowned. The book was an old family ledger, detailing births, deaths, and marriages. Names she recognized filled the pages, great-aunts and distant cousins. But near the back, something strange caught her eye. A page had been torn out. The jagged edge was fresh compared to the fragile, yellowed paper around it. Elise's stomach twisted. Who had removed a page, and why? As she turned away, a soft whisper brushed her ear, so faint she almost thought she imagined it. "Leave while you can." She whirled around. The library was empty. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. Amelie tugged at her sleeve. "Maman, I'm cold." "Come, Mon Ange," Elise said, steadying her voice. "Let's find somewhere warmer." But even as she led Amelie away, she could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, as the wind howled around the crumbling walls of the Moreau estate, Elise lay awake beside her sleeping daughter, her mind spinning with unease. She had come back to Saint-Emilion seeking safety. Instead, she had found a house full of secrets, and someone or something that did not want her here. Tomorrow, she vowed, she would begin to find answers. No matter what they might cost. The next morning dawned cold and bright, the mist burned away by the pale sun. Elise woke to the sound of Amelie humming softly as she played with her stuffed rabbit at the foot of the bed. For a moment, everything seemed almost normal. But then she remembered the torn page. The whisper. The figure in the window. Today, she would search for answers. After breakfast, Elise wrapped Amelie warmly and gave her a coloring book and some crayons she had found in an old drawer. "Stay here, Mon Ange. I'll just be nearby." Amelie nodded, absorbed in her drawing. Elise moved quietly through the house, her footsteps muffled by the thick dust. She tried doors she hadn't dared to open before. Most led to empty bedrooms, their curtains moth-eaten and their wardrobes bare. But halfway down the east corridor, she found a door that would not open. It was heavy, made of oak, reinforced with iron bands. The keyhole was large, almost large enough to peer through. She tried the handle again. It didn't budge. Strange. Why lock a room in a house no one lived in anymore? Elise knelt and peered into the keyhole. At first, she could see nothing but darkness. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw the faint outline of something hanging. She pulled back sharply, heart pounding. Was it a curtain? Or something worse? Before she could look again, a floorboard creaked loudly behind her. She spun around. The corridor was empty. But the air had changed. Heavier, colder. A whisper slid along the walls, too faint to catch. Shaken, Elise retreated to the kitchen, where Amélie was still happily drawing. "All done, maman," the little girl said proudly, holding up a picture. It showed a big house under a gray sky, just like the one they were in. But in one of the windows, Amélie had drawn a small, dark figure. "Who's that, Sherry?" Elise asked, trying to keep her voice light. Amélie shrugged. "A lady. She watches us." Elise's hands tightened around the paper. Later that afternoon, as the wind began to rise again, Juliette finally returned. The older woman looked flustered, her arms full of shopping bags. "I got delayed," she said, brushing past Elise without meeting her eyes. "You must be starving. I'll make dinner." While Juliette bustled around the kitchen, Elise gathered her courage. "Juliette," she said quietly, "what's behind the locked door in the east wing?" Juliette froze, a loaf of bread halfway to the counter. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, without turning around, she muttered, "It's best not to poke around in old places. Some things are better left undisturbed." Her voice was tight, almost angry. "But what's in there?" Elise pressed. "I saw." Juliette whirled around, her eyes wild. "Forget what you saw," she snapped. "Forget it." The kitchen fell into heavy silence. Amélie looked up from her coloring, wide-eyed. Juliette seemed to sag, suddenly old and tired. "I'll tell you this much," she said, voice low. "Not everything that walks these halls is among the living." Then she turned away, banging pots loudly to end the conversation. Elise said nothing more. But that night, as the house creaked and groaned under the weight of the wind, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She had to know what was behind that door, no matter the cost. The next day arrived wrapped in a thick fog. The fields beyond the house vanished into a wall of white mist, and the trees stood like ghostly sentinels in the distance. Elise felt the weight of the locked door pressing on her mind. She could not stop thinking about it. The house itself seemed to hum with secrets, as if it were alive, breathing in the silence. Juliette was nowhere to be seen. Only a note was left on the kitchen table. "Gone to the village. Back before sunset. Juliette." Elise knew this was her chance. She searched the house methodically, opening drawers, lifting rugs, tapping on the walls. Dust swirled around her as she moved. Hours passed with no sign of a key. Her hopes began to wane. But then in the library, tucked behind a stack of ancient books, she found something. A small iron key, rusted but still solid. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. Could it be the key to the locked door? A floorboard creaked upstairs. Elise froze. "Amélie?" she called out. No answer. She raced upstairs. Amélie's room was empty, her crayons scattered across the bed. Panic gripped Elise's chest. "Amélie!" she shouted. A faint giggle echoed down the corridor. Not Amélie's voice. Higher. Older. Mocking. Elise spun around, clutching the key. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the whisper that drifted towards her. "Come find me." She turned towards the east wing, towards the locked door. She ran, her feet slipping on the worn floorboards. At the door, she shoved the key into the lock. It resisted at first, then turned with a grinding click. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the light from the corridor. "Amélie!" Elise whispered. No answer. Only the heavy, suffocating silence of a room that had not been entered in decades. Steeling herself, Elise stepped inside. The air was icy cold. Dust coated every surface. The faint scent of lavender, faded and rotten, lingered in the room. Against the far wall, a massive four-poster bed stood, its curtains moth-eaten and drooping. And on the bed, Elise stifled a gasp. There lay a figure, covered in a tattered white sheet. Frozen in fear, she took a trembling step closer. The sheet shifted slightly, though there was no breeze. Elise backed away, heart hammering, when a faint voice whispered from beneath the sheet. "Stay with me." She stumbled backwards, out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. The key slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Breathing hard, she turned, and saw Amelie standing at the end of the corridor, staring at her with wide, fearful eyes. "Maman," she whispered, "the lady doesn't want us to leave." Elise gathered Amelie in her arms, heartbreaking with terror and love. They needed to get out. Elise hardly slept that night. Every creak of the old house felt magnified in the darkness. Shadows shifted along the walls, and the distant whispering seemed to seep through the very stones. Amelie clung to her mother, her small fingers tight around Elise's arm. Even in sleep, her face was troubled, murmuring soft words that Elise could not understand. At the break of dawn, Elise rose. She needed answers, and she was determined to find them. She remembered the portraits in the main hall, those grand paintings that had once seemed only decorative. Something tugged at her mind, an instinct she could not ignore. The house was silent as she tiptoed down the wide staircase. In the early gray light, the portraits loomed larger, their painted eyes following her every move. She stopped before the biggest one, a woman in a flowing blue gown, her face both serene and sorrowful. At the base of the painting, a brass plaque was tarnished with age. She brushed the dust away and read, "Madame Margot d'Argenteuil, 1823. Elise shivered. Margot. Juliet had mentioned that name. A relative of hers, but never spoken of in detail. The woman's eyes seemed almost alive, pleading. Elise stepped closer. That was when she noticed it. The woman's hand, so carefully painted, was pointing ever so subtly to the side of the frame. Following the direction, Elise found a small notch in the wood. A hidden lever. She hesitated only a second before pressing it. A section of the wall clicked and swung inward, revealing a narrow passage, no wider than a closet. The scent of old stone and forgotten memories rushed out. She squeezed inside, heart pounding. The hidden corridor was dark, but a faint light glowed at the far end. She crept forward. The walls were lined with crumbling wallpaper, and along them, scratched into the plaster, were dozens of names. Some she recognized from letters and ledgers left around the house. Others were strangers. And among them, over and over again, one word was carved deeper, angrier than the rest. Margot. The corridor ended at a wooden door. Elise pressed her ear against it. She heard soft weeping from the other side. Gritting her teeth, she pushed it open. Inside was a small, circular room. Dust hung thick in the air. In the center stood a cradle, ancient and broken. Beside it, a rocking chair moved back and forth on its own, creaking mournfully. On the walls, childlike drawings covered every surface. Crude sketches of women with hollow eyes, of children trapped behind bars, of a dark forest swallowing a house whole. Elise felt bile rise in her throat. This was not a nursery. It was a tomb for lost innocence. As she backed away, something cold brushed against her hand. She turned to see a piece of fabric snagged on the doorway, a piece of Amelie's nightdress. Fear gripped her. They were not safe. And the house was not merely haunted by memories. Something was alive. Something angry. And it wanted Amelie. Elise stumbled back into the corridor, heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed for her to flee, to grab Amelie and never look back. But deep down she knew. Running would not save them. The house had already marked them. She rushed back through the hidden passage, bursting into the main hall, only to find Amelie standing there, alone. The child's face was pale, her eyes distant, her lips moving silently as if speaking to someone unseen. Amelie! Elise cried out, racing towards her. At the sound of her mother's voice, Amelie blinked, the strange trance breaking. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she collapsed into Elise's arms. She was here, Amelie whispered. The lady in blue. She was angry. She said I must stay. Elise held her close, trying to hide her terror. They needed help. Someone who knew the truth about this cursed place. Juliet. Elise seized the dusty telephone on the side table and dialed frantically. 1 ring. 2. 3. Finally, Juliet answered, her voice sharp with worry. Elise? What's wrong? You must come, Elise gasped. There's something inside this house. Amelie. She's in danger. Please. There was a heavy pause on the other end. Then Juliet said, voice low and trembling, stay away from the library. Whatever happens, Elise, do not enter the library. The line went dead. Elise stared at the receiver, cold dread washing over her. The library? Why the library? A sudden noise, the sound of heavy dragging, echoed from the far side of the house. She turned towards it, every muscle tense. The grand doors of the library, once locked and sealed, now stood slightly ajar, as if beckoning her inside. Beyond the crack, she glimpsed movement. Something pale. Something waiting. Holding Amelie tightly by the hand, Elise backed away, her instincts battling the rising curiosity. She needed answers. But Juliet's warning rang in her ears. Stay away. Still, a part of her knew that avoiding the truth would not protect them. It would only delay the inevitable. A sudden cold gust of wind blew through the hall, slamming the library doors fully open. From the darkness beyond, a figure emerged, a tall man, dressed in the fashion of centuries past, his eyes hollow, his skin gray as ash. In his hands, he held an ancient iron key. He said nothing, simply pointed the key towards Elise and Amelie, and then towards the library. An invitation. Or a command. Amelie whimpered, hiding her face in her mother's coat. Elise gritted her teeth. They could not run forever. If the library held the truth, they would face it. Together. She took a trembling step forward, her heart pounding louder than the storm outside. And with Amelie at her side, she crossed the threshold into the darkness. The library swallowed them whole. The heavy doors slammed shut behind Elise and Amelie with a booming finality that echoed through the endless rows of crumbling bookshelves. A thick, choking dust hung in the air, disturbed by their every movement. Shadows twisted between the shelves, whispering in voices too faint to understand yet heavy with meaning. The room was massive, much larger than the house should have allowed. The walls stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness. At the far end, beneath a towering stained glass window shattered into spiderweb cracks, stood a single lectern. Upon it rested a book. Ancient. Bound in blackened leather. The Book of Whispers. Elise tightened her grip on Amelie's hand as they moved forward, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if invisible hands tried to pull them back. The whispers grew louder with each step. Now she could almost make out words, urgent and pleading. Return. Release. Remember. Amelie clutched Elise's arm. She's watching, the little girl breathed. Elise swallowed hard. She could feel it too. A presence. Cold. Furious, ancient. As they approached the lectern, the book suddenly snapped open by itself, pages flipping furiously as if alive, until it stopped on a page marked with strange sigils and faded ink drawings. There, scrawled in an ancient dialect that Elise somehow understood, were instructions. A ritual. A way to end the curse. But the ritual demanded a price. 1 soul, freely given. Before Elise could react, a voice, soft and mournful, filled the library. You have entered the sacred hall. You have seen the key. Now you must decide. Elise spun around. The lady in blue stood at the foot of the lectern, her long flowing gown torn and bloodied, her face a mask of sorrow and rage. Her voice was a blend of sadness and command. One must stay so the others may leave. Amelie whimpered and pressed closer to Elise. No, Elise said firmly, her voice shaking but her resolve hardening. We won't sacrifice anyone. The lady's expression twisted into something terrible. The stained glass window behind her shuddered and cracked further. You must choose, the lady hissed, or the house will feast on you both. The floor beneath them groaned, books toppling from the shelves as invisible forces whipped the air into a frenzy. Elise looked down at the Book of Whispers. The writing shimmered. Another way. Hidden beneath the original text, a new path revealed itself. Uncover the truth. Heal the wound. Bind the spirit. No sacrifice needed, but it would require confronting the deepest darkness within the house. Elise grabbed Amelie, pulling her behind her protectively. "We'll find the truth," she said, her voice clear, cutting through the storm. The lady in blue shrieked, a sound of unbearable grief and rage, and the entire library shook as if the house itself roared in protest. The lectern burst into flame, and the Book of Whispers burned with it. But not before Elise saw the next clue seared into her mind, an image of an old well, hidden in the heart of the garden behind the manor. That was where the real story began. And maybe, just maybe, where it could end. The night air bit into their skin as Elise and Amelie stumbled into the overgrown garden behind the manor. The moon hung low and sickly yellow, casting twisted shadows across the broken statues and wild hedges. In the center of the garden, half buried under a tangle of vines and dead leaves, they found it. The well. It was ancient, its stones blackened by centuries of moss and decay. The iron grate that once sealed it lay rusted and torn aside, as if something had clawed its way free from within. Amelie tugged at Elise's sleeve, her voice barely a whisper. "I hear them." Elise knelt by the edge of the well, peering into the darkness below. A cold, damp breath rose to meet her, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable sound of crying. Not one voice. Many. Children, women, men, weeping, begging, calling for help. The stone walls around the well were carved with faded markings, matching the sigil she had seen in the Book of Whispers. This place was not just a well. It was a prison. Amelie shivered violently, clutching Elise's arm tighter. "We have to help them," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. Elise nodded, though fear gripped her heart like a vice. The instructions from the library flashed again in her mind. Uncover the truth. Heal the wound. Bind the spirit. Taking a deep breath, Elise searched the ground around the well and found a small, weathered locket, its chain broken and twisted. Inside, the miniature portrait of a woman, the lady in blue, and a small boy, both smiling, untouched by the horrors that came after. Elise gasped softly. The lady had once been a mother. A wife. A living, breathing woman, full of love. Something terrible had happened to tear her apart. As Elise stood holding the locket, the ground trembled beneath them. The vines recoiled, and the mouth of the well gaped wider, revealing a spiral staircase leading down into utter darkness. Amelie stepped back, eyes wide with terror. But Elise knew they had no choice. They had to go down. They had to face whatever truth lay buried deep within. Clutching the locket tightly, she looked at Amelie and said, "Stay close to me, no matter what happens." Amelie nodded bravely. Together, they descended into the depths. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The cries grew louder, twisting into words that clawed at Elise's mind. "She loved us. She lost us. She wants us back." Suddenly, the stairwell opened into a vast underground chamber, lit by a dim, unnatural light. At its center stood a withered tree, its roots sunk into the stone floor, blackened and dead. And hanging from its branches were dozens of shadowy figures, suspended like puppets. The souls trapped by the lady's grief. At the base of the tree knelt the lady herself, weeping silently, her body racked with sorrow. She didn't look monstrous now. She looked broken. Lost. Elise stepped forward, holding out the locket. "You loved him," she said softly. "You lost him. But you don't have to stay trapped." The lady slowly raised her head. Her hollow eyes locked onto Elise, and for a terrible moment, it seemed the spirit would lash out. But then, she saw the locket. And something in her shifted. The air around them grew still. The souls in the tree shuddered, then slowly began to descend, their chains snapping like brittle twigs. The lady in blue rose to her feet, the sorrow in her face lifting just slightly, as if some unbearable weight had been lessened. But the darkness had not been defeated yet. It stirred beneath the roots of the tree, furious, ancient, and hungry. Elise and Amelie had freed the souls. Now, they would have to confront the true evil that lurked at the heart of Maison de Corbin. A low rumble shook the chamber as Elise and Amelie stood frozen beneath the withered tree. The ground cracked open at the roots, and from the darkness below, a figure began to rise. It was not the lady in blue. This was something else entirely. A creature born of centuries of grief, anger, and betrayal. The figure towered over them, its form constantly shifting. Sometimes it wore the face of a grieving mother. Sometimes the snarling visage of a beast. Other times, it was little more than a swirling mass of shadows and teeth. Amelie whimpered, hiding behind Elise. But Elise forced herself to stand firm, the locket still clutched in her hand. She could feel its warmth, a reminder that not all was lost. The entity spoke, its voice a chorus of agony and rage. "You freed them," it hissed. "You took them from me." The air around them grew thick and heavy. Breathing became a struggle. Walls of shadow slithered closer, hungry to drag them into oblivion. Elise remembered the final words written in the Book of Whispers. Confront the wound. Name it. Banish it. She understood now. The lady's grief had been twisted into something monstrous by an ancient malevolent force, the true heart of darkness that had poisoned Maison de Corbin. Gathering every ounce of courage, Elise stepped forward. She raised the locket high and shouted over the howling winds. "You are not sorrow. You are not love. You are what remains when hope is abandoned." The entity roared, its form buckling and contorting as if her words had struck a mortal blow. "She loved them," Elise cried, voice fierce and unwavering. "And love is stronger than you." The locket in her hand flared with brilliant light, golden and pure. The shadows recoiled, shrieking in pain. The ground beneath their feet trembled violently. The tree cracked apart with a deafening snap, its roots withering into dust. The monstrous entity lunged, a final desperate attempt to snatch them into the abyss. But Elise held firm. She focused all her will, pouring it into the locket. The light exploded outward, swallowing the shadows whole. The screams of the entity faded into a thin, miserable wail, then silence. When the light dimmed, Elise and Amelie found themselves standing in a hollow, empty cavern. The cursed tree was gone. The oppressive darkness had lifted. Above them, the moonlight shone through cracks in the earth, painting the chamber in soft silver. Elise fell to her knees, exhausted but relieved. Amelie rushed to her side, embracing her tightly. They had done it. The nightmare that had haunted Maison de Corbin for generations was over. But as Elise looked at the broken remnants of the well, a chill passed through her. Some wounds, even when healed, leave scars that never truly fade. In the distance, she thought she heard a faint whisper carried on the wind. Not malevolent. Not angry. Just sorrowful. Remembering what once was and what was lost. She squeezed Amelie's hand, grounding herself in the here and now. The house might always carry its ghosts, but it would no longer be ruled by them. The first light of morning painted Maison de Corbin in shades of soft gold and pink. For the first time in centuries, the old estate did not seem menacing. It seemed at peace. Elise and Amelie stood before the crumbling facade, the locket still warm against Elise's chest. Behind them, the well was nothing more than a pile of stones. The oppressive energy that had once bled from the house was gone. Amelie tugged at Elise's sleeve. "Will we stay?" she asked softly, hope glimmering in her eyes. Elise hesitated. The house still held memories, echoes of pain and sorrow. But it was also a place where healing could begin. A place where they could write new stories, free from the chains of the past. "We'll make it ours," Elise said, smiling. "Our home." Together, they walked through the grand doorway. The entrance hall, once dark and suffocating, now felt spacious and full of light. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows. Room by room they explored. In the library, ancient books lined the shelves, waiting for curious hands. In the ballroom, faded murals hinted at grand celebrations once held here. In the garden, wildflowers had begun to reclaim the land, painting it in bursts of color. They would repair what they could. They would honor what must remain untouched. And they would live, truly live, in a place that had long forgotten joy. As Elise pulled away a heavy curtain in the sitting room, she uncovered a hidden door behind it. A small ornate door, carved with ivy and roses. Intrigued, she opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny room, barely large enough for two people to stand. At the center sat a dusty pedestal, upon which rested a simple glass dome. Beneath the dome was a single, perfectly preserved blue rose. Elise gasped softly. The lady in blue's final gift. Amelie tiptoed closer, her eyes wide. "What does it mean?" she whispered. Elise placed a hand over Amelie's heart. "It means love endures, even when everything else fades." They stood there for a long time, bathed in the soft light of morning, feeling the quiet, unbreakable thread that tied the past to the present. Not with chains, but with love. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the ivy along the stone walls. The house sighed, not with grief, but with relief. And somewhere, in a realm just beyond sight, the lady in blue smiled. At last, her story, and her sorrow, had found its ending. Elise and Amélie stepped out into the new day, the future unfolding before them like a tapestry yet to be woven. Maison de Corbin had been many things. A house of tragedy. A home for lost souls. A tomb of secrets. Now, at last, it was a sanctuary. A new beginning. A place where the light would always find a way inside.